For Captain James Carter, flying wasn't just a career, it was his entire life. At 42 years old, he had logged over 15,000 flight hours, crossing thousands of miles and transporting millions of passengers. His uniform was always crisp, his flight plans always executed with precision, and his cockpit always felt like home. In the air, he was in control. Flying had always been his passion. From the moment he took his first flight lesson at 16 years old, he knew this was what he was born to do. But James wasn't just known for his skills in the air. He was known for his calm demeanor, his discipline, and his ability to handle anything thrown his way. In all his years as a pilot, he had seen everything. Unruly passengers, medical emergencies, unexpected turbulence, even a mid-air proposal gone terribly wrong. But nothing, not even the strangest flight stories he had heard from fellow pilots, could have prepared him for what he was about to experience on Flight 317 from New York to London. Because on that flight, James would come face to face with something impossible, something that defied logic. And it all started after landing, when one passenger refused to leave. From the outside, Flight 317 was completely routine. The takeoff was smooth, the passengers were calm, the weather was perfect. The in-flight crew handled everything flawlessly. But for some reason, James couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. It wasn't anything obvious. The instruments were functioning properly. His co-pilot, Ryan, was chatting casually about his upcoming vacation. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, serving meals and smiling at passengers. Everything was normal. And yet, deep down, James felt something was off. It was like a presence he couldn't see, something just outside of his awareness. At one point, he even glanced over his shoulder in the cockpit, feeling like someone was watching him. But there was no one there. He shook it off. He was just tired. After all, pilots worked long hours, and international flights were exhausting. Maybe he just needed sleep. But deep inside, he knew. This wasn't just exhaustion. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. Not yet. James exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on the control panel as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet. He had done this thousands of times before. Crossing the Atlantic from New York to London was second nature by now. The hum of the engines, the occasional crackle of the radio, the dim glow of the cockpit controls. It was all so familiar. And yet, something felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it. The instruments showed nothing unusual. The weather was clear, the turbulence minimal. His co-pilot, Ryan, was relaxed, chatting about his upcoming vacation in Greece. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, serving meals and assisting passengers. Everything appeared normal. Still, an uneasiness sat heavy in James's chest. It was like an itch in the back of his mind, just out of reach, impossible to scratch. At one point, he glanced over his shoulder, feeling the oddest sensation, as if someone was watching him. But the cockpit was empty. He forced himself to shake it off. He was tired, that's all. Pilots worked long, grueling hours, and flying overnight international routes could make anyone feel disoriented. Maybe his body was just telling him to get some rest. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. After nearly 7 hours in the air, James and his crew finally prepared for descent. The city lights of London glittered in the distance, growing larger as the plane made its final approach. The routine was automatic now. Flaps extended, landing gear deployed, gentle descent through the smooth night sky. James focused on the runway ahead, steadying the aircraft as they touched down with a perfect landing. The plane rumbled slightly, tires skidding against the pavement, before slowing as they taxied toward the gate. Another successful flight. As soon as the plane came to a full stop, the cabin filled with the usual post-flight commotion. Seatbelts unbuckling, overhead compartments clicking open, passengers stretching as they prepared to disembark. James switched off the engine, running through the shutdown checklist as flight attendants opened the doors. The passengers began filing out, moving down the aisles toward the jet bridge. The flight was over. His job was done. Or so he thought. Just as James was about to leave the cockpit, his head flight attendant, Megan, approached him with a strange expression on her face. "Captain," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if nervous. James frowned. "Everything okay?" She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, but there's still one passenger left on board." James arched an eyebrow. "Is he asleep?" "No," Megan said, lowering her voice. "He's just sitting there." James glanced toward the cabin, expecting to see an elderly man struggling with his carry-on, or maybe a businessman lost in thought. But Megan's next words sent a shiver down his spine. "He hasn't moved since we landed. He's just waiting, like he's waiting for you." James's chest tightened. That uneasy feeling from earlier returned in full force. He exhaled and nodded. "I'll check it out." He made his way down the narrow aisle, passing empty seats, feeling a strange sense of anticipation he couldn't explain. The overhead lights flickered slightly, probably nothing, just a routine power shift as the aircraft prepared for shutdown. And then he saw him. The last passenger, sitting in the very last row, perfectly still, hands folded, eyes locked onto James with an intensity that made his breath catch. James stopped cold, because the man in the seat looked exactly like him. James's breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the man seated before him. It was like looking into a mirror. Same sharp jawline, same piercing blue eyes, same exact scar above the right eyebrow. A scar James had gotten when he was 6 years old after falling off his bike. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The man wasn't just similar to him. He was identical. A rush of cold fear crawled up James's spine. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. "Sir," he started, his voice tight. "Are you all right?" The man, his double, smirked slightly, his head tilted, as if studying James with quiet amusement. "I was waiting for you," he said. James froze. His throat went dry. The plane felt unnaturally silent, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. "What did you say?" he asked, barely able to force the words out. "I said," the man repeated, his voice eerily calm, "I was waiting for you, James." James's blood turned to ice. He had never told this man his name. James forced himself to keep his composure. This had to be some kind of prank, a mistake. Maybe the man was a relative, a long-lost cousin, something logical. But his gut told him otherwise. "How do you know my name?" James asked, his voice lower now, guarded. The man simply smiled. "I know a lot of things about you," he said. "I know you were born in Chicago, in a hospital that no longer exists. I know you have a younger sister who lives in Seattle. I know you drink your coffee black, even though you secretly prefer it with cream." James's stomach twisted. Anyone could have researched him, looked up his background, his family. But no one knew about the coffee thing. That was something so small, so insignificant, something only he would know. His breathing grew unsteady. Who are you? The man leaned back slightly, resting his hands on his lap. I think the real question is, who are you? James felt like the air had been sucked out of the cabin. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, to run. But he couldn't, because something deep inside him knew. This wasn't just a bizarre coincidence. It was something else, something he wasn't ready to face. The man sighed, tapping his fingers against the armrest. I know this is hard to believe, James, but you've felt it, haven't you? James frowned. Felt what? The man's eyes darkened slightly. That feeling of wrongness. The sense that something about your life doesn't quite fit. That there's a gap, a missing piece you can't explain. James opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. Because the truth was, the man was right. James had always felt it. That strange, creeping sensation that something in his past wasn't as it seemed. It had always been there, lurking in the back of his mind. The way he sometimes woke up feeling like he didn't belong in his own life. The unexplainable déjà vu that hit him at random moments, like he had lived this exact day before, like he had been someone else. A sharp knock on the cockpit door made James flinch violently. "Captain," Megan's voice called out. James snapped his head toward the front of the plane. He blinked, and when he turned back, the seat was empty. The man, his double, was gone. James's breath shuddered out of him as he stumbled forward, gripping the headrest for support. He looked left, then right. There was nowhere for him to have gone. The cabin door was still locked. The aisles were empty. It was as if he had never been there at all. James's fingers dug into the seat fabric. His vision swam. Was he losing his mind? Or had he just spoken to someone who was never supposed to exist? James barely remembered the rest of that night. He went through the motions, leaving the aircraft, heading to his hotel, staring blankly at the walls of his room for hours. The next day, he did something he had never done before. He dug into his past. He requested his original birth records. When they arrived, his hands trembled as he opened the envelope. And what he found shook him to his core, because his birth certificate had been altered. There were 2 names listed originally, but one had been erased. James Carter had been born with a twin brother who had never been mentioned, never been found, or worse, never been meant to be found. And that was the day James realized. Some truths are buried for a reason. James never saw the man again, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder either. Because somewhere out there, someone else was looking back. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories Unfolded. What do you think happened on that plane? A long-lost brother, a glitch in reality, or something even more unexplainable? Let us know in the comments.